Have you ever been in a room where everyone treated you like you were invisible, like you didn't matter, like your very presence was somehow an inconvenience to their perfect little world? I have. And what happened that night changed everything. Let me take you back to that evening. An evening that started with polite smiles and expensive wine, but ended with jaws dropping and faces turning pale. I'm going to tell you exactly what it feels like to be underestimated, mocked, and dismissed, only to watch those same people realize they've made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. This isn't just a story about revenge or vindication, though there's plenty of that. This is about dignity, about knowing your worth when everyone around you is telling you that you have none, and about that incredible moment when truth becomes impossible to ignore. I'm still processing everything that happened, and honestly, sharing this with you feels like finally releasing a breath I've been holding for months. So, settle in, because this journey is going to take us through some dark places before we reach the light. And I promise you, every single moment of it is absolutely true. My name is Michael, and I've spent the last 15 years building something from nothing, climbing a ladder that seemed impossibly tall, facing rejection after rejection, and learning that success isn't just about what you achieve, but about how you handle yourself when people assume you've achieved nothing. The night I'm about to describe happened 3 months ago, but the roots of this story go back much further, to a version of myself that would have never imagined ending up in a boardroom, let alone at the head of one. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, I learned early that respect isn't given freely. It's earned through hard work, persistence, and sometimes through proving wrong every single person who doubted you. My father was a mechanic, my mother worked at the local grocery store, and money was always tight, the kind of tight where you wear your older brother's hand-me-downs until they literally fall apart, where family vacations meant camping in the state park, where college seemed like something that happened to other people's kids. But my parents instilled something in me that no amount of money could buy, a belief that my circumstances didn't define my potential, that intelligence and determination could open doors that seemed permanently locked. I studied like my life depended on it because in many ways it did. Scholarships became my obsession. Every test was an opportunity. Every assignment was a chance to prove I belonged in rooms where people like me weren't typically welcomed. I got into a decent state university, worked 3 jobs to cover what the scholarships didn't, slept maybe 4 hours a night, and graduated at the top of my class in business administration. The corporate world, though, that was a different beast entirely. Having the right degree was one thing, but not having the right connections, the right background, the right way of speaking, the right clothes, the right everything that signals you're one of them, that made everything exponentially harder. My first job was at a consulting firm where I was essentially the coffee guy who occasionally got to sit in on meetings, always in the back, always silent, always aware that I was there to learn my place more than to contribute ideas. But I watched, and I listened, and I absorbed everything. I noticed how decisions were made, how relationships were built, how power dynamics played out in conference rooms and over expensive lunches. I saw who got promoted and why, and more importantly, I saw who got overlooked and why. It wasn't always about competence or results. It was about perception, about making the right people comfortable, about fitting into an existing mold. I decided early on that I would learn to navigate this world without losing myself in it, that I would play the game when necessary but never forget where I came from or what really mattered. Years passed, and I moved from company to company, each time taking a step up, building a reputation as someone who delivered results even when the odds were stacked against him. I specialized in corporate restructuring, helping struggling companies identify inefficiencies and implement changes that actually worked, not just looked good on paper. It was unglamorous work, the kind that required diving deep into data, talking to employees at every level, and making recommendations that sometimes upset powerful people who preferred things to stay exactly as they were. But it was effective, and slowly, very slowly, I built a name for myself. By my late 30s, I had founded my own consulting firm, started with just me and a rented office space that was basically a closet with a window, but within 5 years we had grown to a team of 15 talented professionals who shared my philosophy, that real change comes from understanding systems, not just imposing solutions from above. We worked with mid-sized companies mostly, businesses that were large enough to have complex problems but small enough to actually implement meaningful change. Our success rate was exceptional, and word spread in the industry circles that If you wanted transformation rather than just a glossy report, you called us. About 8 months ago, I was approached by the board of directors of a major manufacturing company, let's call it Titanium Industries, about a potential consulting contract that could evolve into something more permanent. They were facing serious challenges, market share declining, employee morale at an all-time low, several quarters of disappointing earnings, and a management team that seemed more interested in protecting their positions than addressing fundamental problems. The initial conversations were promising. They seemed genuinely interested in substantive change, and after several months of negotiations and preliminary assessments, they offered me a position on the board of directors with a specific mandate to oversee operational restructuring. It was a massive opportunity, the kind that could establish my firm as a major player in corporate governance and strategy. The contract was complex, confidentiality agreements were signed, and the official announcement was scheduled for the following quarter to coincide with their annual shareholder meeting. In the meantime, I would be working behind the scenes, analyzing operations, meeting with department heads, and preparing recommendations. This is where things get interesting, and where that dinner party enters the picture. Have you ever been in a situation where you know something important that others don't, and you have to just smile and nod while they make complete fools of themselves based on their ignorance? Keep watching, because what I'm about to tell you will make you rethink every assumption you've ever made about a stranger. One of the board members, a man named Richard Pemberton, decided to host what he called an intimate dinner party at his penthouse apartment in the city, one of those spaces that screams old money with its marble floors, original artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the waterfront. The guest list was primarily board members and senior executives from Titanium Industries, along with their spouses and a few select others from their social circle. I received an invitation, which surprised me initially, since I was still technically just a consultant at that point, and the board appointment hadn't been announced publicly. The invitation came through Richard's assistant with a handwritten note saying that Richard thought it would be good for me to meet some of the key players in a more relaxed, social setting before things became official. It seemed thoughtful, even kind, a gesture of inclusion into their world. I should have known better. I should have recognized the setup for what it was. But I was still naive enough to believe that professional respect might translate into social acceptance. I spent probably too much time deciding what to wear, settling on a well-tailored navy suit that was nice but not ostentatious, the kind of outfit that I hoped would allow me to blend in without calling attention to my outsider status. My wife Jennifer couldn't attend because she was out of town visiting her sister who had just had a baby, so I was going solo, which I'll admit made me more nervous than I wanted to acknowledge. Walking into that penthouse felt like entering a different dimension. The kind of wealth on display wasn't flashy or nouveau riche. It was understated in that way that only comes from generations of money, where every object has a story and provenance matters more than price tags. Richard greeted me at the door with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, welcoming me in a tone that was polite but somehow managed to convey that my presence was being tolerated rather than celebrated. The other guests were already there, clustered in small groups with crystal glasses of wine or cocktails, engaged in conversations that paused momentarily as I entered, eyes scanning me with that particular assessment that wealthy people perform on newcomers trying to place you in their mental hierarchy, determining whether you're worth their attention or just part of the background noise. I recognized several faces from board meetings and company events, but in this context, dressed in their casual, expensive clothes, relaxed and laughing among friends, they seemed like completely different people, more themselves perhaps, certainly more comfortable than they ever appeared in professional settings. I grabbed a glass of wine from a passing waiter, something French that probably cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a month, and tried to find my footing in this unfamiliar terrain. The evening started innocuously enough. I had a pleasant conversation with one of the other board members about the upcoming football season, exchanged pleasantries with a senior vice president about the weather and traffic, all surface-level interactions that felt safe and manageable. But as dinner approached and people had consumed more alcohol, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were subtle at first but became increasingly uncomfortable. We moved to the dining room, a space dominated by a table that could easily seat 20, set with china and silverware that looked like it belonged in a museum, and I found myself seated near the middle of the table, not at the ends where Richard and another senior board member held court, which I interpreted as neutral territory, neither honored nor dismissed. The woman seated to my left, Catherine, was married to the company's CFO, and she immediately struck up a conversation that seemed friendly, but had edges I couldn't quite identify at first. She asked where I lived, and when I mentioned my neighborhood, a perfectly nice middle-class area with good schools and tree-lined streets, her smile became slightly fixed, and she said something about how charming those up-and-coming areas could be, with an emphasis on up-and-coming that made it clear she considered it several steps beneath her own address. I laughed it off, made some self-deprecating comment about being more focused on building a business than building a real estate portfolio, which I thought would deflect, but instead seemed to confirm something in her mind. She turned to the man on her left and began a conversation about their recent vacation home purchase in Aspen, speaking loudly enough that several people around us could hear, describing the square footage and the views and the exclusive club membership that came with the property, glancing at me occasionally as if to ensure I understood the vast gulf between our lifestyles. The man seated across from me, James, who held some senior position in operations that I hadn't quite pinpointed, asked what I did for a living with a tone that suggested he was asking more out of obligation than interest. I explained that I ran a consulting firm focused on corporate restructuring and operational efficiency, keeping it vague since I couldn't discuss the specifics of my arrangement with Titanium Industries yet. He nodded slowly, took a sip of his wine, and said something about how there seemed to be a consultant on every corner these days. Everyone with an MBA and a PowerPoint presentation thinking they could tell people who'd spent decades in industry how to run their businesses. There was laughter from several people nearby, that knowing laughter that comes from shared disdain for outsiders who dare to offer opinions. I felt my face flush but maintained my composure, agreeing mildly that there were certainly a lot of consultants out there, but that real value came from understanding that every business was unique and required customized solutions rather than generic frameworks. James didn't seem particularly interested in my nuanced take, instead launching into a story about a consultant his division had hired years ago who had made recommendations that were completely impractical and showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how manufacturing actually worked, and how they had wasted 6 months and considerable money before admitting the whole thing was a disaster and going back to doing things the way they'd always done them. The subtext was clear. Consultants were a waste of money. Outsiders couldn't possibly understand their business, and by extension, I was probably another one of those impractical theorists who would eventually be exposed as useless. I wanted to defend myself, to explain my track record, to detail the successes my firm had achieved, but something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe strategy, maybe just the growing realization that nothing I said would change their minds, because they had already decided who I was based on incomplete information and prejudice. As dinner was served, course after course of elaborately prepared food that I barely tasted because my stomach was in knots, the conversations around me continued in this vein, with various people making comments that ranged from subtly dismissive to overtly condescending. Richard, from his position at the head of the table, held court with stories from his yacht club, describing with great amusement an incident where someone had shown up in inappropriate attire and had to be gently redirected, the implication being that understanding and respecting social codes was a mark of breeding and class that some people simply lacked. Catherine, who had apparently decided I was her project for the evening, asked with feigned concern whether I had gone to business school, and when I mentioned my state university, she made a sympathetic sound and said something about how it must have been challenging to break into corporate consulting without the Ivy League network, as if my entire career was some kind of heroic struggle against the insurmountable handicap of attending a public university. Another woman, whose name I never caught, chimed in with a story about her son who was at Harvard Business School, emphasizing how the connections he was making there were worth more than any amount of technical knowledge, how the real business world ran on relationships and pedigree, and how certain doors simply didn't open without the right credentials. I sat there cutting my perfectly cooked steak into small pieces that I moved around my plate, nodding occasionally, offering minimal responses, watching this performance of class and privilege play out around me. Did any of them actually care about my background or my capabilities? No. This was about reinforcing their own positions, about reminding each other and themselves that they belonged to an exclusive club, and that outsiders could be easily identified and appropriately marginalized. The wine kept flowing, inhibitions dropped further, and the comments became less veiled. At one point, James looked directly at me and said, with a laugh that was meant to soften the blow but didn't, that I seemed like a nice enough guy but probably had no idea what I was walking into with Titanium Industries, that the company was a complex beast with decades of history and culture, that couldn't be understood by looking at spreadsheets and conducting interviews, that real understanding came from years of living and breathing the organization. Others nodded in agreement, adding their own versions of this sentiment, creating a chorus of voices all saying essentially the same thing. You don't belong here. You don't understand our world. You never will. I excused myself at one point, needing a break from the relentless assault of microaggressions and not-so-microaggressions, and found my way to the bathroom where I stood looking at myself in the mirror, this ridiculously ornate mirror with a gilded frame that probably cost more than my first car, and I had to make a decision. I could leave, make some excuse about not feeling well or having an early morning, preserve my dignity by extracting myself from a situation that was only going to get worse as more alcohol was consumed, or I could stay, endure whatever else they had planned, and wait for the moment when truth would inevitably reveal itself. Something in me, maybe stubbornness, maybe a desire to witness their reactions firsthand, maybe just sheer bloody-mindedness, decided to stay. When I returned to the dining room, dessert was being served, some elaborate construction of chocolate and gold leaf that was almost too pretty to eat, and the conversation had shifted to company matters, with people discussing upcoming board meetings and strategic decisions in that casual way that people talk about important things when they assume everyone present is either part of their circle or irrelevant enough that discretion doesn't matter. Richard was describing his frustration with the new direction the board was taking, bringing in outside perspectives that he felt undermined the institutional knowledge and expertise that had made Titanium Industries successful in the first place. He didn't mention me by name, but the timing and context made it abundantly clear who he was talking about, referring to consultants who thought they could waltz in and revolutionize everything without understanding or respecting the foundations that had been carefully built over generations. Several people around the table murmured agreement, adding their own complaints about outside interference and the board's seeming lack of confidence in the existing management team. Catherine, emboldened by wine and the supportive audience, turned to me directly and asked, with a sweet smile that was absolutely venomous, whether I thought consultants ever considered the human cost of their recommendations, whether they cared about the lives disrupted and careers ended when they suggested restructuring, or whether it was all just numbers and efficiencies to people like me. The question hung in the air, and I felt every eye at the table turn toward me, waiting for my response, perhaps hoping I would become defensive or uncomfortable, giving them further evidence of my outsider status and unsuitability for their world. I took a slow sip of water, giving myself a moment to choose my words carefully, and said that in my experience, the best consultants were deeply concerned with human impact, that sustainable change was impossible without considering the people affected, and that anyone who treated employees as mere numbers was not only ethically wrong, but also practically ineffective. It was a measured response, professional and thoughtful, but it didn't satisfy them because it didn't give them the reaction they wanted. James jumped in, saying that was all well and good in theory, but in practice, consultants came in with predetermined solutions, collected their fees, and left others to deal with the mess that they were essentially mercenaries without real accountability or long-term investment in outcomes. I could have told them right then and there that I wasn't just a consultant, that I was about to become a board member with significant authority over the very decisions they were criticizing, that I would have exactly the kind of long-term accountability and investment they claimed consultants lacked, but the confidentiality agreement I had signed prevented me from disclosing the appointment before the official announcement, and frankly, by this point, I was curious to see just how far they would take this. The answer was pretty damn far. As the evening wound down and some guests began making their departures, a smaller group moved to Richard's study, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books that I suspected were more decorative than functional, and the conversation became even more unguarded. Richard poured expensive scotch for everyone, and in that smaller, more intimate setting, the gloves came completely off. They talked about me as if I weren't sitting right there, discussing what a mistake they thought the board was making, how this represented everything wrong with modern corporate governance, this obsession with outside voices and fresh perspectives at the expense of loyalty and experience. Someone whose name I've deliberately forgotten made a joke about whether I even owned a proper tuxedo, or would show up to formal events in whatever off-the-rack suit I had worn to dinner, and there was laughter, the kind that cuts deep, because it's not meant to be cruel. It's meant to be observational, stating what they considered an obvious truth about the gulf between us. My hands were shaking slightly, I noticed, though whether from anger or humiliation or adrenaline I couldn't quite say, and I carefully set down my glass of scotch, untouched because I needed absolute clarity for what I knew was coming. Catherine, who had apparently appointed herself the voice of concern, said directly to me that she hoped I understood this wasn't personal, that they were all just worried about the company they loved, and that bringing in someone from my background, with my lack of experience in their specific industry and my limited understanding of their corporate culture, seemed like a risk that could have serious consequences. She actually used the phrase "my background" with an emphasis that made it clear she wasn't just talking about my professional experience, but about something deeper, something about class and origin that she considered immutable and disqualifying. I looked around the room at these people who had spent the entire evening trying to make me feel small, trying to establish their superiority, trying to protect their territory from what they perceived as an interloper, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity, a recognition that this moment was going to define how our future working relationship would unfold, and that I had an opportunity here to either shrink from confrontation or stand firmly in my truth. The official announcement wasn't supposed to happen for another 2 weeks, but Richard had broken the confidentiality first by discussing board business and strategy so openly in front of people who weren't authorized to hear it. And technically, he had already revealed enough that anyone paying close attention would know major changes were coming. I stood up slowly, walked over to the window overlooking the glittering city below, all those lights representing lives and dreams and struggles that these people in this room had never had to consider, and I turned back to face them. My voice was calm when I spoke, calmer than I felt inside where my heart was pounding and my mind was racing, and I said that I appreciated their honesty and their candor, that it was actually quite valuable to understand their concerns and perspectives before I officially joined the board of directors as the newest member, with a specific mandate to oversee operational restructuring and strategic realignment. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels physical, like the air pressure has suddenly changed, and I watched as the implications of what I had just said registered on their faces one by one. Richard's face went through several colors, starting with confusion, then recognition, then a deep red that might have been embarrassment or might have been anger, or might have been both. Catherine's mouth literally fell open, her hand still holding her glass of wine frozen halfway to her lips, and for the first time all evening, she had absolutely nothing to say. James looked like he had been punched in the stomach, his expression moving from shock to something that might have been fear as he presumably began calculating all the comments he had made throughout the evening about consultants and outsiders and people who didn't understand their business. I continued speaking, my voice still steady, explaining that the appointment would be officially announced at the next shareholder meeting, that I had been working with the board for several months already on preliminary assessments, and that I was looking forward to working closely with all of them to address the serious challenges facing titanium industries. I thanked Richard for the dinner and the opportunity to meet everyone in such a candid setting, emphasizing the word candid in a way that made it clear I had heard and processed every single insult and dismissive comment, and I said that I thought we had all learned something valuable tonight about the importance of not making assumptions about people based on incomplete information. The walk to the door felt like it took forever, with every eye in that study boring into my back, but I kept my head high and my pace measured, refusing to scurry away like someone who had been caught somewhere they didn't belong. The elevator ride down from the penthouse gave me my first moment alone to process what had just happened, and I have to admit, I was shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself after hours of tolerating their condescension. My phone started buzzing before I even made it to my car, text messages coming in rapid succession, mostly from Richard, asking to speak with me urgently, trying to frame the evening as a misunderstanding, suggesting that things had been taken out of context, or that the alcohol had loosened tongues beyond what anyone intended. I didn't respond that night. I needed space to think and to feel everything I had been suppressing throughout that interminable dinner. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying moment after moment from the evening, hearing their comments again, seeing their faces as realization dawned, feeling that complex mixture of vindication and sadness, because what I had hoped might be an opportunity for genuine connection had instead revealed the depth of prejudice and assumption that I would now have to navigate in my new role. Jennifer called just as I was pulling into our driveway, and hearing her voice, her genuine concern when she sensed something was wrong, her immediate understanding and support when I described what had happened, reminded me why I had fought so hard to build a life and career that could provide for us and our future, why proving those people wrong mattered not for revenge, but for dignity. That night, I barely slept, lying awake replaying everything, questioning whether I had handled it correctly, whether revealing my position had been the right move, or whether I should have waited for the official announcement and let them discover their mistake through formal channels. But ultimately, I came back to the same conclusion that standing up for yourself in the moment, asserting your worth when it's being questioned, refusing to let people make you feel inferior without consequence, those weren't acts of aggression or revenge, they were acts of self-respect. And if I was going to be effective in my new role, I needed to establish from the beginning that I would not tolerate being dismissed or underestimated. The next morning, my phone was full of messages, calls, and texts from various people who had been at the dinner, each with their own version of apology or explanation or attempt at damage control. Richard called 3 times before I finally answered, and his tone had completely changed from the condescending host of the previous evening to something that sounded almost desperate, explaining that he had no idea who I was, that if he had known I was the new board member, the evening would have gone very differently, that he hoped we could move past this unfortunate incident and build a productive working relationship. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him honestly that the evening had indeed been unfortunate, but also illuminating, that I now understood exactly what I was walking into and what attitudes I would need to address, and that I hoped he and the others would be as candid in official board meetings as they had been in his study, because that kind of honesty, even when uncomfortable, was necessary for real change. Catherine sent a long text message that was clearly composed carefully, apologizing for any comments that might have seemed inappropriate, explaining that she had been worried about her husband's position and the company's direction, and expressing hope that I would understand she meant no personal offense. James sent a brief email saying he looked forward to working with me, and that he hoped his comments about consultants wouldn't color our professional relationship. Each of these communications revealed something interesting. They were all focused on managing the fallout and protecting their positions, but none of them seemed to reflect genuine understanding of why their behavior had been problematic. None of them acknowledged the fundamental disrespect and prejudice that had driven their comments. They simply regretted that their target had turned out to be someone with power over their careers. The weeks leading up to the official announcement were tense and strange, with people at Titanium Industries treating me very differently once word had leaked through the grapevine about what had happened at Richard's dinner party. Suddenly, executives who had previously ignored me in hallways were stopping to chat. Administrative assistants were more helpful, meeting invitations multiplied, and the overall atmosphere shifted from dismissive to carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that comes from uncertainty about where power lies and how it might be exercised. I conducted my preliminary assessments with a team from my firm, interviewing employees at every level, analyzing financial data, observing workflows and communication patterns, and what I discovered confirmed many of the concerns that had prompted the board to seek outside help. Titanium Industries was suffering from exactly the kind of institutional rigidity and resistance to change that Richard and his dinner party guests had been defending so vigorously, a corporate culture where loyalty was valued over competence, where questioning established practices was seen as disloyalty, where middle managers protected their territories at the expense of overall efficiency, and where senior leadership had become so insulated from ground-level realities that they genuinely didn't understand why morale was low and productivity was declining. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very attitudes displayed at that dinner party, the assumption that outsiders couldn't possibly offer value, the dismissal of perspectives that didn't align with established wisdom, the protection of privilege and position over performance, were microcosms of the larger problems plaguing the organization. My recommendations were going to be significant and controversial, requiring restructuring of several departments, replacement of some senior managers who had become obstacles to progress, implementation of new performance metrics that actually measured results rather than tenure, and a fundamental cultural shift toward transparency, accountability, and meritocracy. I knew these recommendations would make me unpopular with exactly the people who had attended Richard's dinner party, and I was fine with that because popularity had never been my goal. Effectiveness was. The official announcement came at the quarterly shareholder meeting, with the board chair introducing me as the newest director and outlining my mandate to oversee operational transformation. The room was full of shareholders, employees, media representatives, and industry analysts, and I gave a brief speech about my vision for Titanium Industries, emphasizing respect for its history while acknowledging the need for evolution, recognizing the expertise of long-term employees while also bringing in fresh perspectives, and committing to transparency and data-driven decision-making throughout the restructuring process. I could see Richard and several others from the dinner party sitting in the audience, their faces carefully neutral, and I wondered what they were thinking, whether they understood yet that the changes I was proposing weren't personal vendettas, but necessary steps for organizational survival, whether they would choose to be part of the solution or obstacles to be overcome. In the days and weeks following the announcement, I implemented my recommendations with the full support of the board chair and majority of directors, and the results began speaking for themselves. Departments that had been dysfunctional started functioning more smoothly. Employees who had felt voiceless suddenly had channels to contribute ideas. Inefficiencies that had been accepted as just the way things are were eliminated, and slowly, incrementally, the culture began to shift. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Several senior managers, including James from the dinner party, chose to leave the company rather than adapt to new performance expectations, and Richard eventually resigned from the board citing philosophical differences about the company's direction. Catherine's husband, the CFO, remained but found himself with significantly reduced autonomy as financial oversight became more rigorous and transparent. I won't pretend these transitions were smooth or that I didn't face resistance and criticism, but I also won't pretend to feel guilty about it because the results were undeniable. Within 6 months, employee satisfaction scores had improved measurably, productivity metrics were trending upward, and the company had stopped hemorrhaging market share. What I learned from that evening at Richard's penthouse and its aftermath has stayed with me in profound ways, shaping not just how I approach my work, but how I think about respect, dignity, and the assumptions we make about people based on superficial markers of status. I learned that people will always underestimate you if you give them permission to. That silence in the face of disrespect isn't diplomacy or patience. It's complicity in your own diminishment, and that standing up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable or risky, is essential for maintaining your integrity and effectiveness. I learned that the same people who were so confident in their judgments based on my neighborhood, my university, my lack of yacht club membership, were revealed to be remarkably insecure once the power dynamic shifted, their certainty evaporating the moment they realized I had authority over aspects of their professional lives. I learned that real leadership isn't about making everyone comfortable or popular decisions. It's about having the courage to do what's necessary, even when it costs you relationships or social acceptance, about prioritizing organizational health over individual egos, including your own. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that the class prejudice and status anxiety that drove those dinner party guests to treat me with such condescension isn't unique to them or that specific situation. It's endemic in corporate America and probably in most hierarchical organizations. This belief that certain backgrounds confer legitimacy while others require extraordinary proof of worthiness. This assumption that where you came from determines what you're capable of becoming. Every time I walk into a meeting now, every time I interact with employees at Titanium Industries, I'm conscious of the assumptions they might be making about me and the assumptions I might be making about them, trying to see people as they are rather than as their credentials or pedigree or appearance suggest they should be. The dinner party incident has become something of a legend within the company. The story passed around in whispered conversations and break room gossip, probably embellished with each retelling. And while part of me wishes it had never happened, wishes that first social interaction with key stakeholders had been positive and collegial, another part of me recognizes that it was a gift in its own way, clarifying immediately the challenges I would face and the entrenched attitudes I would need to address, stripping away any illusions about easy acceptance or smooth collaboration. Would I do anything differently if I could go back to that evening? Maybe I would have spoken up earlier, challenged the comments as they were made rather than sitting silently and absorbing them. But then again, Maybe the impact of revealing my position at the end, after they had fully committed to their dismissive attitudes, was more effective than piecemeal corrections would have been, forcing them to confront the totality of their prejudice, rather than allowing them to moderate and justify individual comments. What I know for certain is that I have no regrets about standing up for myself when I did, about refusing to pretend the evening had been pleasant or that their behavior had been acceptable, about using the power I had earned through years of hard work to demand the respect that should have been offered freely but wasn't. Jennifer and I have talked many times about that night and its implications, and she's reminded me that vindication, while satisfying, isn't the same as healing, that carrying around anger or resentment toward those people would only poison my own experience and effectiveness, that the goal should be building something positive rather than punishing those who doubted me. She's right, of course, and I've tried to channel the energy from that experience into constructive action rather than destructive brooding, into proving through results rather than through confrontation that I deserve to be exactly where I am. The relationship between me and the remaining dinner party guests who are still at Titanium Industries is professional and functional, but will probably never be warm or friendly, and I'm at peace with that because I've learned that you don't need to be liked to be effective. You need to be respected, and respect can be earned through competence and integrity, even from people who initially dismissed you. There are moments when I see Catherine at company events, always impeccably dressed and socially gracious, and we exchange polite greetings. And I sometimes wonder if she ever reflects on that evening and what it revealed about her values and assumptions, whether she's learned anything from the experience or simply categorizes it as an unfortunate social miscalculation best forgotten. I wonder the same about Richard, who I occasionally encounter at industry conferences, whether he understands that the institutional loyalty he was defending so passionately at his dinner party was actually protecting mediocrity and dysfunction, whether he's capable of recognizing that the changes he opposed have made Titanium Industries stronger and more competitive, or whether he's constructed a narrative where he remains the guardian of tradition unfairly pushed aside by corporate fads and outside interference. Probably the latter, because people rarely revise their fundamental worldviews based on contradictory evidence. They're much more likely to find ways to preserve their existing beliefs and explain away inconvenient facts. What matters to me is not what they think or whether they've learned anything, but what I've learned and how I've allowed that experience to shape my approach to leadership in life. I've learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, to recognize condescension even when it's wrapped in superficial politeness, to understand that social discomfort is often a price worth paying for maintaining your dignity, and to never apologize for success or qualification that you've earned through merit rather than inheritance. I've also learned compassion for those who haven't had opportunities, who face genuine barriers based on circumstances beyond their control, who work twice as hard for half the recognition. Because I've been there, I know what it feels like to be on the outside looking in, to be judged before you've said a word, to carry the weight of low expectations, and that knowledge makes me a better leader, because I can see talent and potential in places where others might overlook it. The consulting firm I founded has expanded significantly since I took on the board position at Titanium Industries. The visibility and credibility from that role opening doors that had previously been closed, and I've been intentional about who we hire and how we operate, prioritizing diverse backgrounds and perspectives, valuing competence over pedigree, creating pathways for talented people who might not have traditional credentials, but have the intelligence, work ethic, and innovative thinking that drive real results. It feels like a small way of disrupting the systems that tried to keep me out, of extending to others the opportunities that I had to fight so hard to access, of building something that reflects the values I've developed through experience rather than the values I was taught by people like Richard and Catherine. My story isn't unique. There are countless people who have faced similar situations, who have been underestimated and dismissed based on superficial characteristics, who have had to work harder and achieve more to receive a fraction of the recognition and respect that others receive simply for existing in the right circumstances. And if sharing my experience helps even one person find the courage to stand up for themselves or the perspective to challenge their own assumptions, then the discomfort of that dinner party and its aftermath will have served a purpose beyond my personal vindication. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Beyond the satisfying moment of watching privileged people realize they've misjudged someone with power over their careers, beyond the schadenfreude of seeing condescension turn to desperation, beyond the surface-level drama of that dinner party revelation. The real lesson is about knowing your worth even when everyone around you is telling you that you're worthless, about maintaining your dignity even when you're being systematically diminished, about having the courage to stand in your truth even when it would be easier or safer to shrink yourself to fit others' expectations. It's about recognizing that the opinions of people who dismiss you based on where you live, or where you went to school, or how you speak, or any other superficial marker, are not actually informed opinions worth internalizing. They're reflections of those people's insecurities and limitations, not statements about your actual value or potential. It's about understanding that success isn't just climbing the ladder but pulling that ladder up behind you so others can't follow. It's about changing the systems and structures that made climbing so difficult in the first place. About using whatever power and influence you gain to make the path easier for those who come after you. It's about knowing when to be patient and when to speak up, when to let things slide and when to draw a line, when to be diplomatic and when to be direct, because navigating professional and social hierarchies as an outsider requires sophisticated judgment about which battles matter and which don't. And maybe most importantly, it's about not letting bitterness or anger poison your success, about channeling difficult experiences into constructive action rather than destructive resentment, about proving yourself through results rather than revenge, about building something meaningful rather than just tearing down those who doubted you. I still think about that evening sometimes, usually when I'm facing a difficult decision or a challenging interaction, and I draw strength from the memory of standing up for myself, of refusing to accept the role they had assigned me, of trusting that my qualifications and character would ultimately matter more than their prejudices. It reminds me that respect is something you claim rather than something you wait to be given, that silence isn't always golden, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak your truth clearly and without apology, and that the people most confident in their superiority are often the most fragile when that superiority is questioned. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to thank you for listening, for caring enough about one person's experience to invest your time and attention, and I want you to know that your experiences matter too. Your struggles and victories and moments of standing up for yourself are valid and important, even if they never get shared on YouTube or become legendary within your organization. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you, where you were dismissed or condescended to based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge of who you are and what you're capable of? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I believe we learn as much from each other's experiences as from our own, and sharing these stories creates connection and solidarity among people who have navigated similar challenges. Understanding the dynamics of prejudice, assumptions, and power is crucial for anyone trying to build a career or create change in established organizations, because these forces are real and pervasive even when they're not openly acknowledged, and the better we understand them, the better we can navigate them effectively. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own experiences or changed how you think about the assumptions you make about others, please leave a like to help others find this content. I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more authentic stories about real experiences, challenges, and transformations, because I believe in the power of truthful storytelling to help us understand ourselves and each other more deeply. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories, because I'll be sharing more experiences that I hope will inspire, challenge, or simply remind you that you're not alone in whatever you're facing. Thank you for being here, for listening, for engaging with this story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by others' opinions or assumptions. It's determined by your character, your efforts, and your commitment to being authentically yourself even when that's difficult. Never let anyone make you feel small. Never accept disrespect as the price of professional advancement, and never doubt that you deserve a seat at any table where your skills and perspective can contribute value. The world needs more people who refuse to accept arbitrary limitations based on background or circumstance, who challenge established hierarchies not through destruction, but through excellence, who prove through their actions that merit matters more than pedigree, and who use their success to create opportunities for others rather than pulling up the ladder behind them. That's the legacy I'm trying to build. That's the change I'm trying to create. And I hope in some small way, this story contributes to that larger transformation. Take care of yourselves, stand up for yourselves, and never forget that you're worthy of respect simply because you're human, not because of where you came from or where you're going, but because dignity is a birthright. not an achievement to be earned. Until next time, keep sharing your truth because that's how we change the world one honest story at a time.